The photograph keeps its own weather. Even before you know what you're looking at, some part of you lowers its voice. It's a cabinet card from 1898 mounted on cream stock with a faint gilt rule, the kind a studio used when it wanted to broadcast solidity without vulgarity. A family of 4 arranges itself into a future. Father standing with a hand on a carved chair, mother seated with dignity that reads as thrift turned into grace. An older boy with a part so sharp a comb must have been punished for it, and a girl, 8, perhaps 9, poised on the fringe of a painted garden where the ivy never climbs too high. The studio stamp makes a small parade beneath: Whitlock and Sons, photographic rooms, Court Street. On the back, a pencil hand that practiced neatness before a schoolmistress's bell taught it to hurry. McRae, September 10th, 1898. Someone has added later, in a different pencil, the sort of caption that both helps and hurts. Before we moved west. There is nothing ostentatious in the scene. The father's coat is a good one, too warm for the day, worn because certain kinds of men think a camera asks for wool. His watch chain makes a modest gleam from buttonhole to pocket, proof of punctuality more than wealth. The mother's hair is parted with missionary exactness and drawn into a coil heavy enough to assure the town she's earned it. The boy's jacket pulls a little across one shoulder, as if growth has taken to arriving unannounced. Everyone has consented to stillness. At first, you will admire the girl's dress, a white pinafore over a dark frock, a hem let down once and let down again, the ghost of old stitches a low horizon at her calf. A ribbon, white, hopeful, has been persuaded to make a bow and placed at her crown as if to argue successfully with gravity for a minute. Her hands rest where the photographer has placed them, one on the sash at her waist, one near the chair leg, and her chin tilts obediently toward the black square of the lens. If she smiles at all, it is with the corners, like a child who knows what rooms expect and has decided to oblige them for the length of a hymn. You think ordinary, you think respectable, you think this is exactly how families wish to be seen when the century was almost out of breath and already reaching for another. Only later, because someone tells you, or because you too have acquired the habit of disobedient seeing, do you go where the picture is trying very hard to keep you from going. You ignore the father's chain and the mother's cuff and the boy's part, and you bend, you trespass. You bring the image too close to your face, and then you see it. At the base of the girl's right wrist, just above the cuff of the dark dress, a narrow band glints where the fabric has shifted. It is not ribbon. It is metal, too thin to be jewelry fashionable enough for the day, and too mechanical to be an heirloom. From it, a chain no thicker than a pencil lead descends into the shadowed web between chair leg and floor. 2 links are visible. The third disappears below the carved volute of the foot, where something darker, not shadow, not paint, makes a small, uncompromising ellipse. A padlock, half hidden in the scrollwork. The light finds it as light tends to find what doesn't want to be found, a tiny white along the curve of a shackle, then nothing. Once you see the chain, you cannot ask your eyes to be polite. You begin to inventory. The girl's left sleeve sits slightly higher than the right, as if a cuff has been shoved up to accommodate something that needed room. There is the faintest abrasion, not bruise, but not bruise, a ring of skin at the narrowest part of the forearm that is paler than the flesh above and below. The dress's waist ribbon has been retied in haste. One tail dangles long, the other short, and the girl's gaze, which at first you would have called compliant, has an odd geometry. The pupils hold catchlights that do not quite square with the lamp's reflection in the father's eyes, as if she's been instructed to look at the lens and prefers stubbornly some margin just beside it, the place where relief might enter if invited. The chain is the terrifying detail, not because it is iron, though it is, not because it implies harm, though it does, but because it declares that control has been invited into the frame, not by accident, but as a household fact. To understand why it is there, you must leave the studio's clean light for a minute and enter the weather that made this day. The town is made of brick that thinks of itself as permanent, and boards that know better. A river squats at one edge, brown as tea left too long. Men talk of steel as if it were a doctrine and coal as if it were a sun. Women turn economy into an art the men will never learn to praise properly. Their name is McRae, recently of Pennsylvania, and before that Scotland if you listen to how the father's vowels lean. His name is Duncan. He counts time in carloads and years in rent receipts. His back, like so many backs that carried the century on its first half, registers the kind of grief that isn't yet dignified enough to be called by its name. The mother is Eliza, a person who has learned to be measured first and kind second, not because the world doesn't deserve her kindness, but because it takes so much of it so quickly. The boy is Hamish. The girl is Nora. This is not their first photograph. There was a small one, ambrotype, oval, a baby who refused to persist, tucked in a drawer with a lock of hair, and a prayer so thin with use it had to be folded into 4 to survive being touched. There was a picture before that of a carriage that wasn't theirs, and a horse with one ear stubborn to the left. There would be a picture after this one of a plot with a white stone that cracked in its first winter. Pictures keep their own ledgers. The chain did not begin in the studio. It began the summer before, when the river made a lyre of its banks. The water rose and then rose again. It did not roar. Roaring is for noble floods that intend to be remembered. It crept. It brought to the McRae yard a smell like metal and unbaked bread. Parents do what parents do. They told children not to go near, not to go if they were told not to touch the edge with a stick to see if it would take the stick or refuse it. Nora obeyed. Mostly. She had inherited from somewhere, grandmother, fairy story, a strand of hair with a memory in it, a habit of night wandering, not sleepwalking exactly, something humbler and more difficult to name. She woke sometimes with the certainty that the house had rearranged itself and needed her to walk through it to help it remember its own corners. If you've never lived with a child like this, you might be tempted to call it stubbornness or mischief. If you have, you know that certain souls do not accept being told daylight, and darkness are separate countries with a passport control between them. They suspect a bridge. They go looking for it. The first time she tried the door at 2 in the morning, no one noticed. The latch stuck in the damp. Summer likes to make accomplices of hardware, and the child's hand could not persuade it to do more than complain. The second night she succeeded, but the cat, a dignity in whiskers, announced the crime with a yowl and was rewarded with milk for its citizenship. The third, the river made its sound. Not loud exactly, but insistent, 1,000 soft slaps like polite hands calling an encore, and Nora stepped into it up to her shins before her mother's hand gathered her back. If you want to be generous with fear, say that's where the chain entered the conversation. If you want to be ungenerous, say it had been waiting for its chance. Eliza bought it at Addington's Hardware, where the proprietor pretended he sold nothing but hinges and the occasional pail, and acquired a thriving trade in things people aren't sure they ought to buy in daylight. It was not the heavy chain a junk man would boast about. It was a narrow, clever length of links designed for trunks and travelers, advertised to be light. The padlock came with it, almost an apology, compact, with a key that looked like an illustration that had slipped out of a fairy story and into a pocket. "It's for?" Addington asked without asking. Eliza said, "A trunk," which was not the truth, but the right shape of answer. She took it home and set it on the table and stared at it until the afternoon learned to be brave and the light left the kitchen. They tried it for nights first, looped around the girl's ankle to the bed frame, then abandoned because ankles became a geography of rings no mother could bear to memorize. They tried tying it to the door instead, which soothed the house and punished nobody. They tried simply moving, which fools two kinds of bodies, wood and flesh, for exactly as long as it takes for both to remember what they had wanted to do. Then one afternoon, that shouldn't have been different and was, Nora bolted. Not into water, into road. A wagon was luckier than she was fast. The wheel missed her. The boot that descended from the seat did not. It was meant as a shepherding gesture. It met the rib instead. No break, just a blue that became an alphabet on skin and stayed through 3 baths and a prayer. No one said chain that night. Eliza brought out the length of links and the small lock. With a needle and the kind of patience that both saves and ruins people, she sewed a narrow band into the inside cuff of Nora's dress, a loop that would lie flush when there was nothing to meet it, and accept metal when there was. For pictures, she told herself, meaning, for moments when the world insists on stillness and will not pay later for its own demand. For crowds. For church. For being near the gate. Each phrase was a mercy in its first utterance. And then mercy learned how to be a habit. Duncan disagreed quietly, and then aloud, and then quietly again. He had learned a model of fatherhood that preferred firmness to invention. He argued that gentleness was not keeping their daughter alive. He argued that pride was the luxury you own when the house you keep is not busy teaching itself to swim at night. He argued that men who cannot provide safety acquire a lazy appetite for solace. The chain asked that argument to end. He agreed. He bought a second lock. On portrait day, the chain was not supposed to come. Eliza folded the good frock with its embroidered collar over a chair back the night before, shook out the pinafore, and told herself the cuff loop was a seam left over from one hem to another. She polished shoes and made the boy learn to stand again with both heels flat, like something told to the floor by a better class of person. She braided Nora's hair, and then unbraided and braided it again, because hair sometimes has more opinions than girls ought to be allowed to confess. She put the chain in a drawer and closed the drawer with 2 fingers, as if touching it lightly could insult it into staying put. In the morning, Nora woke with the expression of someone on terms with a plan. She did not resist the bath, cold, quick. She did not shiver when the dress slipped over her shoulders like a decision. She did not argue when the ribbon pricked. She did not make the sound she sometimes made when doors asked to be opened and corners asked to be greeted. She was so good that the house became nervous. On Court Street, Whitlock's assistant watched the McRaes climb the stairs and thought, as assistants do, that this was a meager sky of a family that would photograph well, darks and lights in agreeable proportion. Whitlock himself, who had been a barber before a glass shop, before a photographer, and still carried the habit of tilting a man's head with a comb that had become a lens, greeted them as if greeting were a sacrament. He spoke to Eliza first. He spoke to the children second. He spoke to Duncan last, and on purpose, the way a man does when he wants to keep a room's balance in favor of the person who does most of the balancing. "We'll put the lady here," he said, indicating the chair with the velvet arm worn to wood under the hands of 200 wives and a few men who loved their wives enough to sit where wives sit. "Young gentleman to the right. Master McRae. Fine. Sir. Behind. And the little dove. Here, at the edge. Hand just so. You see the garden?" He meant the painted balustrade, the suggestion of climbing roses that never needed watering. "We'll have the roses frame you." Nora stood where the lens would want her. Eliza adjusted the sash with a downward tug, the unconscious motion of every mother tasked with smoothing what cannot be smoothed. The assistant raised a lamp. Whitlock set the headrest, that gentle iron treachery, a padded fork that holds necks steady, behind Eliza and Duncan, and then did not offer it to the children, honor disguised as omission. He poured collodion like a man who had practiced a liturgy alone until he believed in it more than he believed in himself. He slid the plate into the holder. He stood aside, and in the breath before he spoke, the thing happened that had not happened for weeks and did not happen again for months. Nora ran. It was not a sprint. It was the small forward tug a body makes when it remembers its errand and cannot be convinced to allow a calendar between itself and the errand. Her feet moved enough to smudge the hem, half an inch, then a whole one. No one would have noticed if Eliza had not noticed the angle of the knee and the particular tilt of the chin, the way the child sought always the air outside. The chain was in a drawer. The studio had no door to know. The river was a memory, and upstairs. Eliza stepped to her daughter. She knelt, not fast enough to qualify as alarmed, and not slow enough to justify being called unthinking, and she said very quietly, the way a person placates a startled colt, "Hold." She wrapped the loose end of the narrow chain she had slipped into her pocket that morning. She had not been able not to. Love sometimes arrives as a failure of cowardice, around the cuff loop, and settled the small lock, and fed the chain down through the scroll of the chair leg, and under the foot where no one, not even a man with a camera, would remark it. For a moment, she said to herself, only for this. Almost anyone would forgive a mother anything said in that tone. Nearly everything else about the day can be argued. That cannot. Whitlock saw none of it. He had turned to adjust the aperture. He hummed, as photographers then sometimes did, a single note to quiet the room. The same note barbers hum when they want the back of a head to trust them. He took the cap from the lens. "Hold, if you please," he said. 1, 2, dash. If you're thinking the chain was meant as kindness in its first minute and became something else in its second, you are right. If you're thinking it had been something else for weeks, you are also right. All of this can be true. Truth is a room with more than one chair. The shutter blinked its spoon of time. The plate drank what the room offered. Whitlock replaced the cap with the devotion of a man who likes to believe small black actions can fix the world. The assistant lowered the lamp and in doing so made its reflection spring like bright minnows into the father's eyes, and the boys and the mother's. In the girls, the catchlight stubbornly went oval, not square like the moon before it decides the tide. After, Whitlock made the ceremony he likes to make of extracting the plate and walking it toward his other room, as if carrying an infant or a ledger's sum that could be ruined by a stumble. He put the silver in the bath and rocked it lightly, the way a person rocks a crib out of habit long after the child is done with all that. The image came forward the way bruises do, faster if there is a story underneath. He watched the father's jaw declare its truth and the mother's left hand. You had not seen it before. Now you will never stop seeing it. Grip the chair arm not for dignity, but for equilibrium. He watched the boy become the age he would through the trick of light. And he watched the girl, who had been about to run for a bridge nobody could see, stand where she had been told. Whitlock noticed the chain. Not first. Not with condemnation. Simply as a part of the natural disorder, the lens and chemistry together rearranged into order. He stood there for a long beat with his hand on the pan, and then he did what tradesmen of conscience do when confronted with something neither their contract nor their God anticipated. He printed the plate as it was. He made 2 more exposures without the chain. The first, because Eliza had already slipped the lock and gathered the links again, and the girl had decided to be obedient now that the thing that had wanted her had been made to wait. The second, because habit is a comfort, and he wanted insurance that paper would not come back from the press with a mark no client asked for. He stopped himself from retouching the first one, from rubbing the ghost of metal out along the chair base with a bit of stump and gum. He told himself, this man who had been a barber before he tried to tame light, that he was supposed to leave the face alone because faces are God's, but that fingers and hems belonged to him. For the last time, he was unwilling to choose whom to serve. He cleaned his brush. He wrapped the prints. He handed them to Eliza on Tuesday. She had brought a coin that had not wanted to be parted with, and parted with it anyway. Duncan took the envelope with the expression of a man memorizing the weight of the thing he's supposed to be grateful for. Nora pinched the corner of the mount and then, when the room felt safe enough to trust her, let go. The photograph lived on the mantel for 10 years. It trained the room. Children grew around it the way vines grow around a trellis, not chosen by them. Guests remarked on its nice likeness, or good lighting, or the particular compliment reserved by certain men for wives they think are appropriate to befriend in public. A very composed lady. No one mentioned the chain because no one saw the chain, unless the sun came in low across the parlor at exactly the angle it prefers, found the shackles grin, and insisted. When that happened, it wasn't even the chain most saw first. It was the girl's gaze, returned to them as a dare. After portrait day, the chain returned to its drawer for a week. Then to the foot of the chair at supper, when Duncan's nerves required the quiet of unsurprised children. Then to the pew's leg at church, just in case. Then to the bed again when a dream woke the girl with a key in her throat and the house elected to stay asleep. There is a point at which, only for this, becomes a lie that the person telling it sees through so cleanly they can no longer stand to hear themselves speak. You incur interest on restraint the way you do on debt. It collects, and one day you don't recognize your own book. The incident that changed the chain from habit to confession happened in winter. Not a virtuous storybook winter, just the long kind, grey, spare, with a habit of knocking at doors that are already open. Duncan went out to work with a cough that was being paid by no person and returned with a fever that would not sign any ledger. He was not harsh, not the way stories wish their villains to be. He was an honest man with fewer options each week than the last. Honest men with fewer options often become worse husbands than liars with plenty. He asked, plainly, "Keep her still." He did not say, "I cannot protect us." He did not say, "The house is too loud." He did not say, "My quiet is the last thing I think I own." He did not say, "I am afraid of the river in her." He said, "Keep her still." Eliza heard the rest because wives keep the minutes of conversations men are not brave enough to say out loud. She did as asked. She did as she told herself Mercy asked. She did not produce a lock that day. She produced a length of ribbon that looked like kindness until it became a tourniquet on a life. She did not become cruel that night. She became someone she did not want to meet. There is an alternative history in which Eliza sends the ribbon to hell and her child down the road into snow because movement keeps children warm. There is another in which Duncan leaves and the house learned specialty that gives it breath, taking in washing, darning men's socks into shapes their feet can respect, patience in a spare bed. There is another in which Whitlock never sees the chain, and we do not either, and the future loses a witness. None of those happened. What happened is smaller and meaner, and therefore, like most human things, true. They kept the chain by the door and the ribbon in a hand that sometimes forgot to unclench. Nora grew into the kind of girl who looked out windows with calculation rather than longing. She learned the trick of moving her body very slowly in rooms that have decided they prefer you when you are furniture. She learned to keep secrets by tightening the throat rather than the lips. She learned to lift her left arm in a way that did not pull her right wrist. You could say the terror of the chain is that it implies injury. That is simple. The greater terror is that it becomes a way of thinking. About children. About love. About what even decent people permit in daylight if the neighbors will not punish them for it. The chain does not bruise skin in a photograph. It bruises a century. And yet, human life, being what it is, refused to obey even the chain all the time. Nora grew. She removed the cuff loop herself one afternoon with a kitchen knife that had learned obedience under onions. She cut carefully through stitches and eased the strip of fabric free. She put it in her pocket like a person who has finally stolen back her name. The chain, shocked, hung from the chair foot with nothing to connect to. Eliza came in from hanging shirts and saw the metal and saw the child and saw the knife and sat down on the floor and laughed and cried the way mothers do when they are both relieved and accused. She put the chain in the drawer and did not open the drawer for a month, then for 6 months, then not again until the day they packed to leave. They left because the mill changed owners and felt less like a place men went to feed their families, and more like the kind of room where the owners built chairs for themselves instead. They left because a cousin wrote from Kansas that wheat grew in a way that convinced a person they had a say in it, and houses sat low and you could see weather coming from 2 days away. They left because Duncan's cough became first person and then plural because it added voices until it was a chorus. They left because sometimes the best argument you can make against your own worst habits is a change in horizon. The photograph makes no register of departure beyond the penciled note on the back. That is its second, terrifying trick. Pictures appear to be stops. They are, in fact, levers. If you handle the cabinet card at the Historical Society now, ask nicely, breathe away from the mat, your thumb will encounter the dent where someone pressed too hard in 1921, showing another person where to look. There, you can hear them say. Do you see? The naked eye is not enough. You lean. The chain glints once like a minnow in mud and disappears. People in the new town thought the McCraes had always been theirs. That is how the West convinces itself it has no history that isn't sunlight. Duncan died as a man dies who is tired of teaching his lungs to behave. Eliza learned to live on flat land with a serious sky. Hamish courted a girl who called herself May because given names sometimes prefer a second attempt. Nora got a job in the store that sold notions and needles and hymnals and learned to wrap paper around objects in a way that told the purchaser their shame had been soothed into something respectable. When she married, she did. Don't be surprised. Women who have been convinced to be still often later want movement with authority. She chose a man who disliked locks. He refused to put one on a gate and argued gently with neighbors who told him certain kinds of boys should not be allowed to wander at dusk. He did not cure her. He did something better. He refrained from instructing her how to be free. They had a son who learned to sleep with windows open, and a dog that chose its own hours. The photograph passed hand to hand, as such things do in families. The object people assume everyone else has already said yes to owning, until you find yourself with it, because you happen to be sitting closest to the box on a damp Tuesday. It went to Nora because no one else wanted to be looked at by their younger self every morning. She put it on a mantel only sometimes. She kept it in a drawer more often, not because she was ashamed, but because she had learned that some witnesses need darkness to rest between trials. After Nora died, her daughter, Agnes, a librarian who learned to recognize the difference between trash and relic by lifting a piece of paper and asking it if it had slept well, found the photograph in the drawer. She took it to the library's back room and put it under the cracked magnifier they kept for pages that refused to be obedient with spectacles. She leaned. She saw the chain and did not gasp. She laid a finger very lightly on the glass where the padlock's white had admitted itself, and she spoke to it the way one speaks to a small creature in a tree. "I know," she said. Then she put the photograph in a new sleeve, with a note in pencil that read, "Look at Nora's wrist, lower right." In the 1970s, the Historical Society mounted an exhibit called Ordinary Cautions. Someone clever on the board had decided it was best to name plainly the things the town pretended not to remember. The McCrae portrait hung under even light in a row of faces that looked straight ahead, as if auditioning for forgiveness. The label read, "Family Portrait, 1898. Note the girl's right wrist." Visitors obeyed. They bent. Some saw, and some did not. Some felt virtuous for having come to look at poor old things and discovering uglier old things. Others, the ones who mattered, went home and took their own photographs down and laid them on kitchen tables and looked so closely their breath left clouds and they had to rescue the image with a sleeve. A woman stood in front of the McRae picture for a long time and then asked the attendant if she might sit. She had to. The attendant rolled a stool forward the way they had rolled stools forward for people who recognized themselves in different versions for years. The woman said she remembered a chain in her own house, not for children, but for a door, hooks at night, that declared, "We mean it," and that the sound of metal from a drawer had told her, as a girl, which season the family was entering. She did not accuse her mother. She did not acquit her. She confessed the habit of loving people who make too many little prisons. The attendant nodded because there are moments when nodding is how history accepts payment. A man in his 60s came on a Tuesday and tracked a line with his finger from the image to his pocket and drew out a small brass padlock that could have been the brother of the one in the photograph. "4 trunks," he said. He did not hold it up as evidence. He held it the way people hold cigarettes they have decided to keep, but not smoke, an old decision, modified. Children came through in crocodiles and did the thing children do when told to notice details. They noticed the wrong ones first and, gloriously, arrived unprompted at the right one. "Her hand," a child said, proud of the discovery, because that's what exploring does to the face. "Her hand is caught." The docent, who had learned to avoid sermons, said yes, and did not say what the child might learn later about the degrees of caught. When the internet made amateur detectives of everyone with a cousin and an evening, someone posted a scan of the McRae cabinet card and circled the padlock in a red that overconfidently announces itself as helpful. Comments gathered. Some called it an artifact of retouching, an ink blob pretending to be moral. Some called it a fake, the way people call most truths that make them late for supper. Others told their own stories, how in their house it had been a length of rope, how in their house it had been words, softer and therefore worse, how a photographer in their town used head clamps on children and called it science. A woman who ran a small blog about antique photographs wrote about the chain and received letters addressed to the past that had failed to arrive on time. One read, "If it had existed in our house, I would have used it, and I would have been wrong, and the evidence would be mine to keep." Another, "We used only our voices. They were loud. Tell me if that is better. I don't always know." There is a temptation to make the chain stand for everything a century did incorrectly, to children and to women, and to anyone who got between a man and his belief that the room owed him quiet. Resist it. Let it stand for itself. Let it also do its sneaky work of revealing things you wouldn't have seen otherwise. The way Eliza's mouth draws, not with meanness, but with the tension of a person trying to yoke love and safety into a single ox. The way Duncan's fingers, look, do not close fully around the chair, because the part of him that fears making a fist near his family has begun to outvote the part that thinks a fist is how a man shows he is in charge. The way Hamish's ear sticks out a fraction and will be mocked later, and teaches him the economy of mocking himself first to get it over with. The way Nora's eyes refuse to anchor to the square of light and instead select a point no one else can name, door, window, water, road, and in that act, declare themselves free in the one way that mattered that day. When you are ready to close the case, if you are lucky enough to be holding the original and not a reproduction with a circle and an arrow scolding you where to look, do it softly. The brass clasp has learned 1,000 thumbs and is proud of knowing when to let go and when to hold. Slide the card back into its sleeve. Place it on a table. Consider, before you slide it into the drawer, writing a note that will help the next person without telling them too much. Something like what Agnes wrote: "Look at her wrist, lower right. Also, look at the eyes, leave it there. Then go and look, kindly, at the people you live with. If you find a little chain in your pocket, an old habit, a rule you've smuggled into a room that could be gentler, put it in the drawer and try not to open the drawer for a week. If you fail, forgive yourself, then try again. If you succeed, tell no one immediately. Let the quiet be proof for a time. Teach yourself to spot oval catchlights in eyes where square ones are expected. Teach yourself to hear the currents in a house without believing your job is to dam them. Sometime tonight, washing dishes or turning down a bed, the image will return to you, uninvited, as good witnesses do. You will see the small white of the shackle. You will feel a small hand on your sleeve arguing for a door. You will imagine a river that sometimes exists only in a child. You will think to yourself, not with righteousness, but with the precise mercy a photograph can teach, hold, and then you will add the second part that Eliza forgot and later learned. For a moment, and no more. And if you tell the story to someone who prefers their pasts harmless, and they ask you why this little iron in a picture should matter so much, you will say, because it is small enough to fit into a drawer and large enough to become a country if you let it. Because terror does not need blood to be terrifying. Because what we choose to keep in a frame finds ways to keep us too. Because even in 1898, under lamps and pleats and the smug decency of carved chair legs, a girl located a point beyond the lens and looked at it until it knew its own name.